Desperate and broke, she takes an unusual job, caring for a wealthy paraplegic man, including washing his underwear. He's rude, arrogant, and seems to enjoy humiliating anyone who gets too close. What happens in that mansion over the next few days will shock you. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like this video and tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. Sarah Martinez stared at the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen table, her hands trembling as she calculated the total for the third time. The numbers hadn't changed. They never did. The rent was 2 weeks overdue, and the electricity company had sent their final warning. Her daughter Emily's school supplies list sat mockingly beside the bills, a reminder of yet another expense she couldn't afford. The classified ad she'd circled in the newspaper seemed to glow under the dim kitchen. Light, personal caregiver needed. Salary $8,000 month. Experience preferred but not required. Must be willing to handle intimate care tasks. Immediate start. The salary was almost 4 times what she currently made as a part-time waitress. It seemed too good to be true, and, according to her friend Maria, it probably was. "Listen, Sarah," Maria had warned earlier that day, "I heard about that position. The guy is impossible to work with. 3 caregivers quit in the last month alone. They say he's a nightmare, rich, entitled, and bitter. Plus, the intimate care tasks part. That's a red flag if I ever saw one." Sarah glanced at the photo of Emily on the refrigerator, her gap-toothed smile beaming back at her, unaware of their financial struggles. 6 years old and already so resilient, never complaining when dinner was mac and cheese for the 3rd time in a week, or when they had to skip dance classes because the tuition was too expensive. The sound of small feet padding across the worn linoleum floor pulled Sarah from her thoughts. Emily appeared in her Disney princess pajamas, clutching her beloved stuffed giraffe. "Mommy, I can't sleep. Can you tell me a story?" Sarah pulled her daughter onto her lap, inhaling the sweet scent of baby shampoo. "Of course, sweetie. Which one would you like to hear?" "The one about the brave princess who saves herself. That's my favorite." Sarah's throat tightened. If only real life were as simple as fairy tales. She thought about her abandoned nursing school textbooks, gathering dust in the closet. 2 semesters away from graduation, when she discovered she was pregnant, Jason, Emily's father, had disappeared faster than a paycheck, leaving Sarah to navigate single motherhood alone. The interview was scheduled for tomorrow morning. The modernist mansion on Sterling Heights loomed in her imagination, all glass and steel and judgment. She'd driven past it once, marveling at how different life must be for people who lived in houses like that. Now she might get to see the inside, though not in the way she'd ever imagined. Emily's steady breathing indicated she'd fallen asleep in Sarah's arms. Carefully, she carried her daughter back to bed, tucking her in beneath the faded butterfly comforter they'd found at a thrift store. The girl's peaceful face strengthened Sarah's resolve. Pride wouldn't pay the bills or put food on the table. Tomorrow she would walk into that mansion with her head held high. Later that night, as Sarah prepared for the interview, she laid out her best outfit, a navy blue dress that had seen better days but still looked professional enough. She practiced her responses in the mirror, trying to anticipate questions about her lack of experience. What she couldn't practice for was the reality of what intimate care tasks might entail. The ad had been vague, but the implications were clear enough. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Think carefully about this, Sarah. That kind of money always comes with strings attached." Sarah typed back, "I don't have the luxury of choices right now." As she set her alarm for 6 a.m., Sarah thought about how life had led her to this point. She'd always dreamed of helping others. It's why she'd chosen nursing in the first place. Maybe this job, despite its challenges, was the universe's way of putting her back on that path. Or maybe it was just desperation making her see silver linings where there were only storm clouds. She opened her laptop and researched spinal cord, injuries and paralysis, wanting to be as prepared as possible. The medical terminology felt familiar, awakening memories of late-night study sessions and highlighted textbooks. At least her incomplete nursing education might prove useful. The night stretched on as Sarah continued her research, taking notes and watching care technique videos. Outside her window, The city lights twinkled like distant promises. Tomorrow would either be the beginning of something new or another dead end in a long line of disappointments. Either way, she had to try. Emily deserved a mother who would do whatever it took to give her a better life. Sarah finally closed her laptop and turned off the light, but sleep proved elusive. In the darkness, her mind raced, with questions about the mysterious millionaire who might become her employer. What had happened to make him so bitter? Why was the turnover rate so high? And most importantly, could she handle whatever challenges awaited her behind those imposing gates? The security guard at the gate barely glanced at Sarah's ID before waving her through. The long driveway curved through immaculately maintained gardens, leading to a house that seemed even more impressive up close. Modern architecture stretched toward the sky, all clean lines and massive windows that reflected the morning sun like mirrors. Sarah's worn Honda Civic looked comically out of place next to the collection of luxury vehicles parked in the circular driveway. She checked her reflection one last time in the rearview mirror, smoothing down a stubborn strand of dark hair and taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. The front door opened before she could reach for the doorbell, revealing a tall woman in an impeccable business suit. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Victoria Lawrence, Mr. Armstrong's personal assistant. Please come in." The interior of the house matched its exterior, sleek, modern, and distinctly impersonal. Despite the obvious wealth on display, there was something cold about the space, as if it were a museum rather than a home. Victoria led Sarah through a series of rooms, each more impressive than the last, her heels clicking against the marble floors. "Mr. Armstrong has reviewed your preliminary application," Victoria said, her tone carefully neutral. "I should warn you that he can be direct. Don't take it personally." She paused outside a set of double doors. "Also, don't mention his condition unless he brings it up first. And whatever you do, don't express pity. He detests that above all else." Sarah nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. Victoria opened the doors to reveal a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Behind a massive desk sat Alexander Armstrong, and Sarah's first thought was that the gossip hadn't done him justice. Despite being confined to a wheelchair, he commanded attention, sharp features, penetrating grey eyes, and an air of authority that seemed to fill the room. He couldn't have been more than 40, but stress had left its mark in the silver threading through his dark hair. "So," he said without preamble, "you have no experience as a caregiver." His voice was cold, clinical, like a surgeon preparing to deliver bad news. "I was 2 semesters away from completing my nursing degree," Sarah replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Was?" One eyebrow arched slightly. "What happened?" "Life happened. I became a mother." "Ah, yes, the single mother angle. Very touching." His sarcasm was razor-sharp. "And now you expect me to trust my care to someone who couldn't even finish their education?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "With all due respect, Mr. Armstrong, becoming a mother didn't diminish my capabilities. If anything, it enhanced them. I understand responsibility, patience, and the importance of dignity in care." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at her response. He wheeled himself around the desk, approaching her with calculated slowness. "The job requires total dedication. No calling in sick because your kid has a runny nose, no leaving early for school plays, and the tasks." He paused, studying her face. "Let's be explicit. You'll be responsible for everything. Bathing, dressing, bathroom assistance, everything. Still interested?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I understand the requirements, Mr. Armstrong. I also understand that you've gone through 3 caregivers in the past month. Perhaps the issue isn't just the tasks involved." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Victoria, still standing by the door, made a small choking sound. But Alexander Armstrong didn't explode as Sarah had half expected. Instead, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Victoria, leave us," he commanded, not taking his eyes off Sarah. Once the assistant had quietly exited, he continued, "You're either very brave or very foolish, Ms. Martinez. Possibly both. The salary is non-negotiable, but comes with strict conditions. You'll live here 5 days a week. Your daughter can stay in the guest house with you, but she is your responsibility. If she disrupts my routine in any way, you're both out. Clear? Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected the possibility of bringing Emily with her. It would solve so many logistical problems, not to mention saving on rent. Crystal clear, she replied. One more thing, he added, his tone growing even colder. I don't need your pity, your psychological analysis, or your attempts at friendship. I need a caregiver who can do their job efficiently and silently. The moment you try to fix me is the moment you join the unemployment line. Do we understand each other? Sarah nodded, but inside her mind was racing. What had happened to this man to make him build such impenetrable walls around himself? The answer, she suspected, went far deeper than his physical condition. You start tomorrow, he declared, turning his wheelchair back toward the desk. Victoria will handle the paperwork. Don't make me regret this decision, Ms. Martinez. Sarah followed Victoria out of the office. She could feel Alexander Armstrong's eyes on her back. She had gotten the job, but something told her that was the easy part. The real challenge would be navigating the complex maze of barriers this man had built around himself, barriers that seemed designed to keep everyone at arm's length, no matter how close they had to get physically. The guest house exceeded every expectation Sarah had harbored. Nestled in a quiet corner of the estate's grounds, it was larger than any apartment she'd ever lived in. Emily's eyes grew wide as saucers as they explored their new home, complete with a fully furnished kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a small garden space. Mommy, is this really all ours? Emily bounced on her toes, clutching her stuffed giraffe. 4. Now, sweetie, Sarah replied, trying to temper both their expectations. Remember what we talked about? Mommy has to work very hard to keep this job. Victoria had arrived early to help them settle in and brief Sarah on the morning routine. Mr. Armstrong expects breakfast at exactly 7:30 a.m. He's particular about everything: water temperature, clothing choices, even how his fruits are cut. The previous caregivers found his attention to detail challenging. Sarah listened intently, taking mental notes as Victoria continued her orientation. The morning routine would start at 6 a.m. with assistance in the bathroom, followed by exercise therapy, bathing, and dressing. Everything had to be precise, methodical, and performed without commentary. After getting Emily settled with her books and toys, Sarah made her way to the main house. The morning air was crisp, and the manicured gardens seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. It felt surreal, like stepping into another world entirely. Alexander was already awake when she entered his suite, his expression unreadable as he watched her approach. "You're 3 minutes early," he noted, checking the sophisticated watch on his wrist. "Don't make a habit of it. I prefer punctuality, not eagerness." The morning routine proved to be as demanding as Victoria had warned. Alexander scrutinized every movement Sarah made, his grey eyes following her with hawkish intensity. When she helped him with his exercises, he refused to acknowledge the obvious pain he was in, maintaining a stony silence throughout. The water. "Temperature is 2 degrees too hot," he snapped during his bath. "Did Victoria not show you how to use the thermometer?" "She did," Sarah replied calmly, adjusting the temperature. "Thank you for letting me know your preference. I'll remember. For tomorrow." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps at her lack of defensiveness. The previous caregivers had apparently either argued with him or apologized profusely. Sarah did neither, simply acknowledging the feedback and making the necessary adjustment. As she helped him dress, selecting a crisp blue shirt from his meticulously organized closet, she noticed a photograph partially hidden behind his suits. It showed a younger, standing Alexander with a beautiful woman, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. The happiness in his face was startling compared to the man before her now. "Did I give you permission to snoop through my personal belongings?" His voice cut through the air like ice. "I apologize, Mr. Armstrong. I was simply looking for the shirt you requested. The blue shirts are all together on the left side, as Victoria surely told you. There's no need to look elsewhere." He wheeled himself away from the closet. "I expect you to respect boundaries, Ms. Martinez. This isn't a social visit, and you're not here to satisfy your curiosity about my past." The rest of the morning passed in tense silence. Sarah focused on her tasks, managing to meet his exacting standards more often than not. When she brought his breakfast, exactly at 7:30 a.m., she noticed he barely touched the food, instead focusing on his laptop and phone calls. During a brief respite while he worked, Sarah checked on Emily through the guest house's security cameras, accessible through an app Victoria had installed on her phone. Her daughter was contentedly drawing at the kitchen table, seemingly adapted to their new environment already. "Your daughter?" Alexander's voice startled her. "She's well behaved?" "Yes, very. She understands the importance of following rules." He nodded slightly, then added, "Children can be unpredictable. If she becomes a disruption—" "She won't," Sarah interjected, firmly. "Emily knows this opportunity is important for both of us." Alexander studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You said you were 2 semesters away from graduating. Nursing school isn't cheap. No family to help?" "No," Sarah replied simply, unwilling to elaborate on her personal circumstances. He turned back to his laptop. "Victoria will show you how to organize my medications for the week. Don't expect me to remind you about dosage times. One mistake with those and you're out immediately." The day continued with a parade of physical therapists, business associates, and various staff members coming and going. Alexander treated them all with the same cold efficiency, though Sarah noticed that some of the long-term employees seemed unfazed by his attitude. As evening approached, Sarah was exhausted, but satisfied with her performance. She had survived day 1 without any major mishaps. As she prepared to leave for the guest house, Alexander called out to her, "Ms. Martinez." "Yes, Mr. Armstrong." "Tomorrow, wake me at 5:45 instead of 6Q. I have an early video conference with Shanghai." "Of course. Will you need anything else?" Adjusted in the schedule. He paused, seeming to consider something. "No, just don't be late." His tone was still cold, but something had shifted slightly. Was it approval? Sarah couldn't be sure. Walking back to the guest house, Sarah reflected on the day's events. Alexander Armstrong was exactly as difficult as everyone had claimed, perhaps even more so. Yet beneath his harsh exterior, she had glimpsed moments of something else: pain, loneliness, and perhaps a hint of curiosity about her and Emily. The photograph in the closet haunted her thoughts. Who was that laughing man, and what had happened to bury him so completely beneath layers of bitterness? 2 weeks into her new position, Sarah had settled into a rhythm. She learned Alexander's preferences, memorized his medication schedule, and managed to maintain a professional distance despite their intimate daily interactions. Emily had adapted wonderfully to their new living situation, turning the guest house's small garden into her personal fairy kingdom. The morning started normally enough. Sarah arrived at exactly 6 a.m., prepared for another day of exacting standards and careful silence. But something was different. Alexander was already awake, his face drawn with pain he usually tried to hide. "Bad night?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral as she began the morning routine. "I don't pay you for conversation," he replied, but the usual bite was missing from his voice. As she helped him with his exercises, she could feel the tension in his muscles. Worse than usual. "Would you like me to call Dr. Patterson?" "No." The response was sharp, definitive. "Just be careful with the left side today." Sarah nodded, adjusting her technique to minimize his discomfort. As she worked, she noticed a medical journal open on his nightstand, displaying an article about experimental treatments for spinal cord injuries. Before she could look away, Alexander noticed her gaze. "More snooping, Ms. Martinez." "Professional interest," she replied. "The research has come a long way since I was in nursing school." He was quiet for a moment, then surprised her by asking, "What do you know about stem cell therapy?" Sarah carefully considered her response. "It shows promise, but many of the more aggressive treatments are still experimental. The risks can outweigh the potential benefits." Spoken like someone who actually did pay attention in class. Was that almost a compliment? "Dr. Patterson wants me to consider a new trial program. He thinks I might be a good candidate." "But you're skeptical." Alexander's face hardened. "I've learned not to trust medical promises, or any promises for that matter. Before Sarah could respond, Emily's voice echoed from the hallway. "Mummy, Mummy, where are you?" Sarah's heart stopped. Emily was supposed to be in the guest house. How had she gotten into the main building? Alexander's expression darkened immediately. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Armstrong. This won't happen again." Sarah moved toward the door, but Emily appeared before she could reach it. The little girl stood in the doorway, still in her pajamas, clutching her ever-present stuffed giraffe. Her eyes widened at the sight of Alexander in his wheelchair. "You must be Mr. Armstrong," she said with surprising poise. "I'm Emily. I like your house. It looks like a castle." Sarah held her breath, waiting for Alexander's thunderous reaction. But it didn't come. Instead, he regarded Emily with an expression Sarah hadn't seen before, curiosity mixed with something softer. "Young lady," he said, his tone stern but not unkind, "this isn't a castle, and you shouldn't be wandering around without permission." Emily nodded solemnly. "I know. But I had a bad dream and the nice lady in the suit told me where to find Mommy. Victoria, of course." Sarah made a mental note to discuss boundaries with the assistant later. "Emily, sweetheart, let's get you back to the guest house," Sarah began, but Alexander raised a hand to stop her. "What was your dream about?" he asked, surprising both Sarah and himself, judging by his expression. "Giants," Emily replied matter-of-factly. "They were trying to steal my giraffe. His name is Jeffrey, and he's very brave." She held up the well-loved stuffed animal as evidence. A ghost of a smile touched Alexander's lips. "Giants can be frightening, but I imagine Jeffrey protected you?" Emily beamed. "Yes, he's not afraid of anything. Even when we had to move houses a lot, he was always brave." Sarah saw Alexander's eyes flick to her face at this revelation about their past, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "Emily, Mr. Armstrong has a very busy day ahead," Sarah said gently. "We should let him prepare for his meetings." "Okay." Emily turned to leave but paused. "Mr. Armstrong, your castle needs more colors, and maybe some dragons. Dragons make everything better." After Sarah had escorted Emily back to the guest house and ensured she was safely occupied with breakfast, she returned to find Alexander staring out his window, lost in thought. "Mr. Armstrong, I apologize again for the interruption. It won't happen again." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not respond. Finally, he turned to face her. "Your daughter, and she's very direct. Yes, sometimes too much so. I'm working on teaching her about boundaries." "Don't," the word surprised them both. "At least, she's refreshing. Most people either stare at the chair or pretend it doesn't exist. She just saw me." The moment of vulnerability passed quickly, replaced by his usual mask of indifference. "We're behind schedule now. The Shanghai conference call is in 20 minutes. As Sarah helped him prepare for his day, she couldn't help but notice that his pain seemed to have lessened, or at least he was less focused on it. Sometimes, she realized, the best medicine didn't come from a pharmacy. A month into her employment, Sarah noticed subtle changes in the mansion's atmosphere. The staff seemed less tense, meetings ran smoother, and even Victoria had begun to relax slightly around her. But the biggest change was in Alexander himself. Though he maintained his strict demeanor, the edge of cruelty had softened somewhat. One evening, as Sarah organized his medications for the following week, a distinctive ringtone broke the comfortable silence. Alexander's face transformed instantly, a mix of anger and something else, fear, flashing across his features. "Victoria," he called sharply. When his assistant appeared, he continued, "I thought I told you to block that number." "I did." "Mr. Armstrong," Victoria replied, flustered. "She must be using a different one." Alexander's jaw clenched. "Handle it. I don't want to hear from her again." Sarah kept her focus on the pill organizer, pretending not to notice the tension in the room. But her mind was racing. Her. The woman from the photograph, perhaps. Later that night, after she'd finished her duties and checked on a sleeping Emily, Sarah found herself unable to leave. Alexander sat in his wheelchair by the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminated only by the city lights below. The usual commanding presence had been replaced by something more vulnerable. "You can go, Ms. Martinez," he said without turning around. Your shift ended 10 minutes ago. Would you like some tea before I leave? The words left her mouth before she could stop them. It wasn't part of her duties, but something in his posture spoke of a man who shouldn't be alone. He turned slightly, studying her with those penetrating grey eyes. Earl Grey, no sugar, splash of milk. Sarah moved to the kitchen, grateful for the familiar ritual of tea preparation. When she returned, Alexander had moved to his desk, though he wasn't working. She placed the cup precisely where he liked it, just to the right of his laptop. The woman who called, he said suddenly, was my wife. Ex-wife. Sarah remained silent, knowing any response might cause him to retreat behind his walls again. Rebecca, he continued almost to himself, she was the perfect corporate wife. Beautiful, charming, excellent at hosting dinner parties. Everyone envied our life. He laughed bitterly. What a joke that turned out to be. Mr. Armstrong, Sarah began. Gently. You don't have to. When the accident happened, he interrupted, she stayed for exactly 3 weeks, long enough for the press coverage to die down, long enough to ensure her reputation wouldn't suffer. Then she left. He took a sip of tea, but not before transferring a significant portion of my assets to a private account. Sarah's heart ached at the raw pain in his voice. I'm sorry, she said simply, knowing how inadequate the words were. Don't be. It was a valuable lesson. His voice hardened again. Never trust anyone who claims to love you. They're either lying or they'll leave when things get difficult. Not everyone. Enough. The wall slammed back into place. I don't need your comfort or your platitudes, Ms. Martinez. You may go. But as Sarah turned to leave, he spoke again. The tea was prepared correctly. You may add it to your evening duties. The next morning, Sarah arrived to find Alexander, already engaged in a heated phone conversation. His voice carried through the closed door of his office. I don't care what it takes, James. Buy them out, bankrupt them, whatever it takes. Just get it done. He ended the call abruptly as Sarah entered. Good morning, Mr. Armstrong, she said, beginning their usual routine. Schedule's changed today, he announced. Dr. Patterson is coming at 10. Clear everything else. Sarah nodded, noting the tension in his shoulders. Should I prepare the therapy room? No, this isn't physical therapy. He's bringing information about the trial program we discussed. Alexander's fingers drummed on his wheelchair's armrest. He thinks there's a 60% chance of partial recovery. That's promising, Sarah said carefully. It's a gamble, he corrected. One that could leave me worse off than I am now. But, he trailed off, looking out the window. But sometimes the biggest risks bring the greatest rewards, Sarah finished softly. Alexander's head snapped around, his eyes narrowing. Don't do that. Don't try to understand me or encourage me. You're my caregiver, not my therapist. I'm also a human being who's seen enough of life to know that pushing everyone away doesn't actually protect you. The words came out before she could stop them. For a moment, Sarah thought she'd gone too far. Alexander's expression darkened, and she prepared herself for dismissal. But then something unexpected happened. He laughed. It was short and rusty, like he'd forgotten how, but it was genuine. You're either very brave or very foolish, Ms. Martinez. We've established this before. So you've said, she replied, allowing herself a small smile. Now, would you like to review Dr. Patterson's documents before he arrives? Alexander nodded, and they fell into their routine. But something had shifted, almost imperceptibly. The walls weren't exactly coming down, but perhaps, just perhaps, a few bricks had begun to loosen. Dr. Michael Patterson was nothing like Sarah had imagined. Instead of the stern specialist she'd expected, he was a warm, middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. His presence seemed to both irritate and comfort Alexander, a contradiction that fascinated Sarah. The trial program in Switzerland, Dr. Patterson explained, spreading documents across Alexander's desk, is showing remarkable results. The combination of stem cell therapy and their new rehabilitation protocol could significantly improve your quality of life. Alexander's expression remained neutral, but Sarah noticed his fingers tightening on his wheelchair's armrest. And the risks? Any surgical intervention carries risks, Dr. Patterson admitted, but you're healthy, relatively young, and desperate? Alexander's voice carried a sharp edge. Isn't that what you're thinking, Michael? That I'm finally desperate enough to try anything? The doctor's face softened with understanding. I'm thinking you're finally ready to stop punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault. Sarah busied herself with organizing Alexander's medications, trying to appear invisible while her mind processed this new information. Punishing himself? For what? Ms. Martinez, Alexander's voice cut through her thoughts. You have medical training. What's your opinion? The question caught her off guard. My training wasn't completed, Mr. Armstrong. I'm not qualified to... I'm not asking for a medical opinion. I'm asking what you think. Sarah met his gaze, considering her words carefully. I think fear of failure shouldn't stop us from trying to succeed. But it has to be your decision, not anyone else's. Dr. Patterson smiled approvingly. Your new caregiver seems wise, Alex. A far cry from the last one who kept pushing those questionable herbal remedies. She has her moments, Alexander conceded. The closest thing to a compliment he'd ever given her. Though her daughter seems intent on turning my house into a dragon-filled castle. The doctor's eyebrows rose. You've met her daughter. Hard not to when the child appears like a fairy tale character in my bedroom, Alexander replied dryly, but without the anger such an incident would have provoked a month ago. After Dr. Patterson left, Sarah helped Alexander with his afternoon routine. He was quieter than usual, lost in thought. As she prepared his tea, now a regular part of their evening ritual, he finally spoke. The accident, he said, staring into his cup, wasn't entirely an accident. Sarah froze in the act of arranging his evening medications. My company was about to close a major deal, would have doubled our market value overnight. His voice was distant, remembering. The brakes on my car had been tampered with. Police investigated, but nothing was ever proven. Rebecca, she knew something, I'm sure of it, but by the time I realized that, she was gone with half my fortune. Mr. Armstrong, Sarah said softly, you don't have to... James, my head of security, is still investigating. That's what the call this morning was about. He turned to face her. Why am I telling you this? Sometimes we need to talk, Sarah replied simply, even when we think we don't. A knock at the door interrupted them. Victoria entered, looking unusually hesitant. Mr. Armstrong, there's a situation with the Thompson contract. Legal needs your immediate attention. Alexander sighed. Of course they do. Ms. Martinez, we're done for today. As Sarah walked back to the guest house, her mind whirled with new information. The accident wasn't an accident. Rebecca knew something. Half his fortune gone. It painted a picture far more complex than she'd imagined. Emily was waiting for her, working on what appeared to be an elaborate drawing. Look, Mummy, I drew Mr. Armstrong's castle with dragons protecting it. Do you think he'll like it? Sarah studied the childish artwork, the mansion rendered in crayon, with friendly-looking dragons perched on every turret. You know what, sweetie, I think he just might. Later that night, after Emily was asleep, Sarah sat in their small garden, looking up at the main house. Light still burned in Alexander's office window. She thought about the walls he'd built, not just against emotion, but against trust itself. The accident that wasn't an accident, the wife who betrayed him, the fortune that was stolen. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. How's life with the impossible millionaire? Sarah typed back, more complicated than anyone knows. Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added, but maybe not impossible. As she got ready for bed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something bigger than a simple employer-employee relationship. Alexander's revelations, Dr. Patterson's concerns, the mysterious investigation, it all pointed to a web of secrets she was only beginning to understand. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice wondered if she was ready for what uncovering those secrets might mean, not just for Alexander, but for her and Emily as well. Sarah found herself increasingly drawn into the mystery surrounding Alexander's past. Small details caught her attention. The way Victoria tensed whenever Rebecca was mentioned, the hushed phone calls with James, the growing stack of medical research papers on Alexander's desk. One rainy afternoon, while organizing his closet, as part of her weekly duties, Sarah discovered a fallen box behind his suits. As she picked it up, photographs spilled across the floor. Her heart racing, she quickly gathered them, but not before catching glimpses of happier times, Alexander standing proudly in front of his company headquarters, Rebecca by his side at charity galas, group photos with business partners. One photo in particular caught her eye. Alexander with a man she didn't recognize, both wearing hiking gear, arms around each other's shoulders. The timestamp showed it was taken just weeks before the accident. "What are you doing?" Sarah jumped at Alexander's voice. He wheeled into the closet, his expression thunderous. "I'm sorry, Mr. Armstrong. The box fell. I was just snooping." "Again?" But his anger seemed to deflate as his eyes fell on the hiking photo. "That's Marcus Chen. He was my best friend and business partner." "Was?" Sarah asked softly, still holding the photo. Alexander's jaw tightened. "He left the company a week after my accident, sold his shares to our biggest competitor. Another lesson in trust." He paused, studying the photo. "He was supposed to be with me that day in the car. Last-minute meeting came up." "Or convenient timing," Sarah suggested, before she could stop herself. Alexander's head snapped up, his eyes sharp with interest. "You've been paying attention to the details, haven't you, Ms. Martinez? It's hard not to notice patterns. The timing of Rebecca's departure, Marcus's sale of shares, the tampered brakes. It seems like more than coincidence. James thinks so too." Alexander wheeled himself to the window, rain streaming down the glass. "He's found a paper trail. Rebecca and Marcus, they were seeing each other for months before." "The accident?" Sarah's heart clenched at the pain in his voice. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be. It's ancient history now." But his tone suggested otherwise. "The company merger they orchestrated after my accident made them both very wealthy. They're married now, living in Singapore." A knock at the door interrupted them. Emily stood there holding her dragon drawing. "Mr. Armstrong, I made this for you to protect your castle." The tension in the room dissipated as Alexander turned to face the little girl. "Did you? Let me see." Emily approached confidently, presenting her artwork. "The blue dragon is the strongest. He makes sure no bad people can get in." Alexander studied the drawing with surprising seriousness. "And what about the red one on top of the house?" "That's the wise dragon. She watches everything to keep everyone safe," Emily beamed. "Do you like it?" "It's very thoughtful." Alexander's voice softened slightly. "Though I'm not sure the real estate value of a house improves with dragons." "On the roof," Emily giggled. "You're funny, Mr. Armstrong. Mommy said you never make jokes." "Emily," Sarah interrupted, mortified. But Alexander's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "Your mother is usually right about many things, but perhaps not everything." After Emily left, clutching a promise that her drawing would be properly displayed, Alexander turned back to the scattered photographs. "Put them away, Ms. Martinez, somewhere out of sight." "Of course." Sarah began carefully returning the photos to the box. "Mr. Armstrong, thank you for trusting me with this information." He was quiet for a long moment. "Trust is a luxury I can't afford. But you've proven yourself observant and discreet. Those are valuable qualities in this household." Later that evening, as Sarah prepared his tea, Alexander received another call from James. She tried not to eavesdrop, but fragments of the conversation reached her ears. "Are you certain? When did this transfer happen? Keep digging. There has to be more." After ending the call, Alexander sat in uncharacteristic silence, his tea growing cold. Finally, he spoke. "Ms. Martinez, how much do you know about corporate finance?" "Very little," she admitted. "Why?" "Because I'm beginning to think the accident wasn't just about betrayal. It was about money. A lot of money." He turned to face her. "And I'm going to need someone I can trust to help me prove it." Sarah felt the weight of his words. This wasn't just about being a caregiver anymore. She was being drawn into something much bigger, potentially dangerous. The sensible thing would be to maintain professional boundaries. But as she looked at Alexander, not the bitter millionaire but the wounded man beneath, she knew she couldn't walk away. "What do you need me to do?" His eyes met hers, searching. For something. Perhaps honesty, perhaps loyalty. For now, just keep watching. And be careful who you trust in this house. Even Victoria. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The message was clear. In this game of secrets and betrayals, no one was above suspicion. The following weeks brought subtle but significant changes to the mansion's dynamics. Sarah found herself paying closer attention to everything. The visitors Alexander received, the documents on his desk, the whispered conversations between staff members. She noticed Victoria spending more time on private phone calls, though whether this was suspicious or simply business as usual, she couldn't tell. One morning, while helping Alexander with his exercises, Sarah noticed him wincing more than usual. "The pain is worse today?" "It's fine," he said through gritted teeth, but his grip on the exercise bar was white-knuckled. "Mr. Armstrong, if you're experiencing increased pain, Dr. Patterson should know, especially with the trial program coming up." He released the bar, breathing heavily. "The trial program, I've been meaning to discuss that with you." Sarah waited, continuing the routine stretches with careful precision. "If I decide to do it, I'll be in Switzerland for at least 3 months. He paused, watching her reaction. "The recovery period is extensive. I'd need you to come with me." Sarah's hand stilled. 3 months? But Emily would come too, of course. The facility has accommodations for families of patients. She could even attend the international school there. He spoke with careful neutrality, but Sarah sensed this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment suggestion. "You've already looked into this," she realized. "I look into everything, Ms. Martinez. The school has an excellent reputation. Emily would learn French, make international friends, consider it an educational opportunity." Before Sarah could respond, Victoria burst into the room, her usual composure shattered. "Mr. Armstrong, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'll need to see this immediately." She handed him a tablet and Sarah watched as his face darkened. "When did this happen?" "The documents were filed this morning. James just sent them over." Alexander's jaw clenched. "Get him on the phone, now." He turned to Sarah. "We'll continue this discussion later." Throughout the day, Sarah caught fragments of urgent conversations. Something about shareholders, proxy votes, and a hostile takeover attempt. The mansion buzzed with tension, and even Emily noticed the change. "Mommy, why is everyone so worried today?" she asked during lunch in the guesty house. "Sometimes grown-ups have complicated problems at work," Sarah explained carefully. "But it's nothing for you to worry about." That evening, Sarah found Alexander in his study, surrounded by legal documents. His usual immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, his tie loosened. "Your tea, Mr. Armstrong." "Leave it," he said. Shortly, then sighed. "No, wait, stay. You should know what's happening, especially if you're considering Switzerland." Sarah sat in the chair across from his desk, waiting. "Marcus and Rebecca aren't content with what they stole 6 years ago. They're making a play for my entire company." His laugh was bitter. "The timing isn't coincidental. They know about the medical trial, know I'd be away for months. Vulnerable. Can they do that?" "Legally, it's complicated. They've been buying shares through shell companies, building support among board members. If they succeed..." He trailed off, staring at the city lights below. "You'll fight them," Sarah said with certainty. "Of course. But fighting takes focus, energy. The trial program," when he turned to face her. "I can't be recovering in Switzerland while my company is under attack." "So you're giving up on the treatment?" "I'm being realistic. Sometimes we have to choose our battles." Sarah felt a surge of unexpected anger. "No, you're letting them win twice. They already took your ability to walk. Now you're letting them take your chance to recover it." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah waited for the explosion, for him to remind her of her place. Instead, Alexander studied her with an unreadable expression. "You're angry on my behalf," he observed. "Why?" "Because you deserve better than letting fear rule your life." The words came straight from her heart. "You're stronger than that." Look at me, Ms. Martinez, really look. I'm half the man I used to be, fighting enemies I can't even see clearly. I am looking. I see someone who survived betrayal, who rebuilt his life, who hasn't let his condition stop him from running a global company. Sarah leaned forward. And I see someone who's scared to hope, because hope makes us vulnerable. But without hope, what are we fighting for? Alexander's fingers drummed on his armrest. A habit she'd learned meant he was processing something difficult. Finally, he spoke. If, and this is purely hypothetical, if I pursued both battles at once, I'd need someone I could trust, completely. Someone who could be my eyes and ears here while I'm in Switzerland. You mean Victoria? No. His eyes locked with hers. I mean you. Sarah felt the weight of what he was suggesting. Mr. Armstrong, I'm just a caregiver. I don't know anything about corporate espionage or... You know more than you think. You notice things, you understand people. He leaned forward. And most importantly, you have something no one else in my life has demonstrated. Genuine loyalty. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. Emily stood in the doorway in her pajamas. Mommy, can you read me a story? Alexander straightened, his professional mask sliding back into place. We'll continue this discussion tomorrow, Ms. Martinez. Consider carefully what I've said. As Sarah walked Emily back to the guest house, her mind raced. She was being offered a role far beyond her qualifications, in a situation that could be dangerous. The sensible choice would be to decline politely, to maintain professional boundaries. But something deeper pulled at her, a desire to help this wounded man fight his battles, to see him heal both physically and emotionally, and, perhaps though she hardly dared admit it, something more. The decision to help Alexander fight his battles came with immediate consequences. Sarah found herself drawn into a world of corporate intrigue she barely understood. Victoria began giving her strange looks, especially when she spent extra time in Alexander's office, reviewing documents she pretended to understand. These financial reports, Sarah said one evening, frowning at the complex spreadsheets. There's something odd about the timing of these transactions. Alexander wheeled closer, their shoulders almost touching as he leaned to look at her screen. What do you mean? Well, I'm not an expert, but these transfers, they started exactly 2 months before your accident. Small amounts but consistent, like someone was testing the waters. His expression sharpened with interest. Show me. Sarah highlighted the pattern she'd noticed. Regular transfers to offshore accounts, each just small enough to avoid immediate suspicion. As she explained her observations, she became aware of how close they were, of the subtle scent of his cologne. You have good instincts, he said softly, still studying the screen. James has been tracking similar patterns, but he missed this connection. I probably only noticed because I'm used to watching every penny in my own budget, Sarah admitted. When you live paycheck to paycheck, you become very aware of money patterns. Alexander turned to look at her, their faces unexpectedly close. You're far too intelligent to have spent your life living paycheck to paycheck. Life doesn't always give us what we deserve, she replied, meeting his gaze. Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that had nothing to do with financial records. For a moment, Sarah thought she saw something in his eyes, a softening of his usual guard. The moment shattered as Emily's voice carried from the hallway, along with Victoria's protective protests. But I need to show him. It's important. Emily burst into the office, clutching a tablet, with a flustered Victoria right behind her. Mr. Armstrong, look what we learned in science class today. To Sarah's surprise, Alexander didn't seem annoyed by the interruption. What did you learn? Emily held up the tablet, showing a video about spinal cord research. They're helping people walk again, just like what Dr. Patterson talked about. I heard you and Mommy discussing it. The room fell silent. Victoria looked horrified, but Alexander's face showed an unexpected mix of emotions. Emily, Sarah started, we shouldn't... No, Alexander interrupted. Let her speak. He turned to Emily. What else do you know about this research? The scientists use special cells that can heal things, Emily explained earnestly. and the people have to be really brave because it's hard work. But look, she scrolled to another video showing a patient taking their first steps after treatment. They don't give up even when it's difficult. Alexander watched the video, his expression unreadable. "Out of the mouths of babes," he murmured. "I don't understand," Emily said, looking between the adults. "Why aren't you excited? Don't you want to try walking again?" "Emily!" Sarah exclaimed, mortified by her daughter's directness. But Alexander raised a hand to stop her apology. "It's not that simple, Emily. Sometimes, adults, we let fear stop us from trying, even when we know we should." "That's silly," Emily declared with childish certainty. "Fear is just a feeling. Mommy says feelings can't hurt us unless we let them." Sarah watched as Alexander absorbed this simple wisdom. His face softened, and for a moment she saw past his defenses to the man underneath, vulnerable, yearning, and perhaps ready to hope again. "Your mother is a wise woman," he said finally. "Victoria, please take Emily to the kitchen for some ice cream. I need to speak with Ms. Martinez." After they left, Alexander wheeled to the windows, his typical thinking spot. Children have an annoying habit of cutting through our carefully constructed excuses, don't they? They see things simply, Sarah agreed, without all the complications we adults add. "I've been using the company situation as an excuse," he admitted. "The truth is I'm terrified, not just of the surgery failing, but of it succeeding, of having to learn who I am without all these walls I've built." Sarah moved to stand beside his wheelchair. "You're still the same person who built a global company, who survived betrayal, who keeps fighting despite everything. The walls don't define you, they just hide you." He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw raw vulnerability in his eyes. "And what if I've forgotten who I am without them?" "Then you'll discover who you are now," she said softly. "And you won't have to do it alone." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Alexander reached out, his hand hovering near hers for a moment before dropping back to his armrest. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice low and intense. "If we do this, the surgery, Switzerland, fighting for the company, it won't be safe. Marcus and Rebecca, they're dangerous people. They won't hesitate to hurt anyone who stands in their way." "Are you trying to scare me away?" "I'm trying to protect you, you and Emily. You've brought something back to this house that I thought was lost forever. I won't risk your safety." Sarah felt her heart skip at his words. "What have we brought back?" Alexander turned back to the window, but not before she caught a glimpse of emotion in his eyes. "Life," he said simply. "You've brought life back." The decision to proceed with the treatment in Switzerland set off a whirlwind of activity. Dr. Patterson arrived daily for pre-surgery evaluations, while James increased security around the mansion. Victoria coordinated with the Swiss medical facility, arranging accommodations and transportation. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, balancing her regular duties with learning everything she could about the company. Alexander spent hours teaching her the basics of corporate operations, explaining what to watch for, who to trust, and most importantly, who not to trust. "The board meeting minutes from last quarter," he said one afternoon, pointing to his laptop screen. "Notice anything strange?" Sarah leaned in, scanning the document. "These two board members, their voting patterns changed suddenly. They used to support you consistently, but now..." "Exactly. Marcus has probably gotten to them. Money or blackmail. It doesn't matter which." Alexander's hand brushed against hers as he scrolled through the document. "You're getting good at this." "I have a good teacher," she replied, trying to ignore the warmth that spread from where their hands had touched. Emily, meanwhile, had thrown herself into learning French with characteristic enthusiasm. She practiced with the mansion's chef, who was from Paris, and left little notes around the house in her newly learned vocabulary. One evening, Sarah found Alexander in his study, reading one of Emily's notes with an almost smile on his face. "Your daughter," he said, "has informed me that my chateau needs a bibliothèque for all my livres ennuyeux." "She called your books boring?" Sarah laughed. "I'm so sorry." Don't be. She's not wrong. He set the note aside. The Swiss school will be good for her. She has a natural gift for languages. She has a natural gift for breaking down walls, Sarah said softly. Something she and I seem to have in common. Alexander looked at her intently. The walls were there for a reason. Were they? Or were they just easier than risking being hurt again? Before he could respond, James burst into the study, his usually calm demeanor shaken. Sir, we have a problem. Rebecca's been spotted in the city. Alexander's face hardened. When? Yesterday. She's staying at the Four Seasons under an alias. And she's not alone. Marcus is with her. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. The enemy was no longer a distant threat, but here, in their city. Alexander wheeled himself to the window, his posture tense. They're here to stop you, Sarah realized. They know about Switzerland. Of course they do. They probably have someone on the medical board. Alexander turned to James. Increase security, especially around the guest house. I want Ms. Martinez and her daughter protected at all times. Already done, sir. But there's more. James hesitated. They've scheduled a meeting with the board for next week. The same day. You're supposed to leave for Switzerland. The timing wasn't coincidental. They were forcing Alexander to choose between his company and his chance at recovery. Sarah watched as he absorbed this information, his knuckles white on his wheelchair's armrests. No, she said firmly, surprising both men. They don't get to win like this. Ms. Martinez, Alexander began, but she cut him off. You can do both. Go to Switzerland. Fight for your recovery. I'll stay here with James, monitor the situation, be your eyes and ears. We can use video conferencing for the board meeting. You don't have to be physically present. It's too dangerous, Alexander protested. If they realize you're involved, then they realize I'm not just a caregiver anymore. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I'm your partner in this fight. The word partner hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond its business connotation. James tactfully excused himself, leaving them alone with the gravity of the moment. Sarah, Alexander said softly, using her first name for the first time. I can't ask you to risk everything for me. You're not asking. I'm choosing. She moved, closer to his wheelchair. You've spent 6 years letting them control your life, limit your choices. It's time to take that power back. He looked up at her, conflict clear in his eyes. And Emily, are you willing to risk her safety too? Emily taught me something important, that sometimes the brave choice is the right choice, even when it's scary. Sarah smiled. Besides, she'd never forgive me if I let the dragons abandon their castle. A ghost of a smile touched Alexander's lips. You're either very brave or very foolish. How many times have I said that now? Enough times that you should know the answer by now. Sarah's voice softened. I believe in you, Alexander. In your recovery, in your fight for the company, in your capacity to trust again. The question is, do you believe in yourself? The tension in the room shifted, became something else entirely. Alexander reached out, taking her hand in his. The touch was electric, sending shivers up her arm. I'm beginning to, he said quietly. Thanks to you. The moment was interrupted by Emily's voice in the hallway, chattering away in her mixture of English and French. They quickly separated, but something had changed irrevocably between them. Lines had been crossed, boundaries blurred. As Sarah helped Emily with her French homework later that night, she couldn't stop thinking about the touch of Alexander's hand, the look in his eyes. She was no longer just his caregiver, and he was no longer just her employer. They were standing on the edge of something new and terrifying and wonderful. But with Rebecca and Marcus in the city, and the fight for the company looming, Sarah knew the real challenges were just beginning. The question wasn't just whether Alexander could learn to walk again, but whether he could learn to trust, to love, to live fully again. And somewhere deep in her heart, Sarah knew she was no longer just fighting for him. She was fighting for them both. The week before Alexander's departure for Switzerland was filled with intense preparation. Sarah spent every spare moment studying company documents, learning the intricacies of board politics, and memorizing the faces of potential allies and enemies. Security around the mansion had doubled, with James's team maintaining constant surveillance. "They've made reservations at Lambert's for tomorrow night," James reported during their morning briefing. "Rebecca and Marcus will be meeting with 3 board members." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Which ones?" "Harrison, Chen, and Powell." James displayed their photos on the tablet. "All 3 have been wavering in their support recently." Sarah studied the images, committing them to memory, the same ones who changed their voting patterns last quarter. "You've taught her well," James remarked to Alexander, something like approval in his voice. The days took on a frantic rhythm. Dr. Patterson visited daily, conducting final evaluations and preparing Alexander for the intensive rehabilitation that would follow the surgery. Sarah noticed that despite his outward calm, Alexander's tension showed in small ways. A tightness around his eyes, fingers drumming more frequently on his wheelchair's armrest, sleep patterns becoming more erratic. One evening, she found him in his study well past midnight, staring at old photographs spread across his desk. The one on top showed him standing at a podium, accepting some business award, Rebecca beaming proudly beside him. "You should be resting," Sarah said softly. "Tomorrow's schedule is packed." "Do you know what the worst part of betrayal is?" he asked, not looking up. "It's not the pain or the anger, it's the doubt, the constant questioning of every memory, wondering if any of it was real." Sarah moved closer, her heart aching at the raw hurt in his voice. "Not everything in the past was a lie, wasn't it?" He picked up the photo. "Look at her smile, so perfect, so loving, all while she was planning to destroy me with Marcus." "Maybe it wasn't all planned," Sarah suggested gently. "People change, make bad choices. It doesn't necessarily mean everything before was false." Alexander finally looked up at her. "You always try to see the best in people, don't you?" "Not always, but I've learned that carrying anger only hurts the person holding it." "Wise words from someone so young," he said with a hint of his usual sardonic humor. "I had to grow up fast," Sarah replied simply. "Being a single mother tends to do that." Alexander wheeled himself to the window, his typical refuge for difficult conversations. "I've been meaning to ask you something. About Switzerland." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Yes?" When the surgery is successful, the rehabilitation will be intense. Months of work, pain, frustration. I won't be easy to deal with." "Are you suggesting you've been easy to deal with so far?" The gentle teasing came naturally now. He almost smiled. "Fair point, but this will be different. I'll be vulnerable, dependent in new ways. I need to know—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I need to know you'll be there, not just as my caregiver, but—" "But?" Sarah prompted softly, her pulse racing. Before he could continue, Emily's voice drifted in from the hallway, followed by Victoria's hushed tones. Sarah turned to find her daughter in the doorway, clutching Jeffrey the giraffe. "Mommy, I had another bad dream." The intimate moment shattered. Alexander straightened in his wheelchair, his professional mask sliding back into place. "You should tend to your daughter, Ms. Martinez. We have an early start tomorrow." Sarah hesitated, wanting to recapture the moment, to hear what he'd been about to say. But Emily's needs came first. They always had. Later that night, after settling Emily back to sleep, Sarah stood in their guest house garden, looking up at the mansion. Light still burned in Alexander's study. She thought about how much had changed in the months since she'd first walked through those imposing gates. The desperate single mother and the bitter millionaire had both transformed, their lives intertwining in ways neither could have predicted. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Security alert. Rebecca spotted at hotel bar with board member Powell. Sending details." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Tomorrow Alexander would leave for Switzerland, placing his trust in her to protect his interests here. The stakes were enormous. His company, his future, and perhaps something even more precious that neither of them had dared to name. A movement caught her eye. Alexander had wheeled himself onto his balcony, his silhouette stark against the eager, warm light from his room. For a moment their eyes met across the distance. He raised his hand in a small gesture, and Sarah returned it, feeling the weight of unspoken words between them. Tomorrow would bring challenges they could only imagine. But tonight, in this quiet moment, Sarah allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling in love with Alexander Armstrong. Not the bitter millionaire, but the wounded, complex man beneath the armor. The man who made dry jokes to make Emily laugh, who trusted her despite his fears, who was finally ready to fight for his future. The question was, would he let himself fall too? Or would the ghosts of past betrayals keep his heart locked away forever? As if reading her thoughts, Alexander wheeled himself back inside, the balcony door closing with a finality that echoed in Sarah's heart. Tomorrow would change everything, for better or worse. She just prayed they were all strong enough for what lay ahead. The morning of Alexander's departure dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the tension filling the mansion. Sarah arrived early to find Victoria, orchestrating a small army of staff members, coordinating last-minute details with military precision. "The medical transport will arrive at 10, Victoria informed Sarah, handing her a thick folder. "These are all the contact numbers you'll need. The Swiss facility, Dr. Patterson's satellite office there, the legal team. And this," she lowered her voice, "is James's private line. Use it if anything feels wrong." Sarah nodded, tucking the folder into her bag. "Has there been any more activity from Rebecca and Marcus?" "They're keeping to their hotel, but James's team spotted them meeting with 2 more board members this morning." Victoria hesitated. "Sarah, be careful. They're dangerous people." The use of her first name caught Sarah's attention. Victoria had always maintained strict professional boundaries. "You know something, don't you? About what really happened 6 years ago?" Victoria glanced around before stepping closer. "I was here that day when Rebecca left. She wasn't just taking money. She was looking for something in Alexander's office, something specific. I never told him because, well, he was dealing with enough." Before Sarah could press for more details, Alexander's voice carried from his suite. "Ms. Martinez, a moment, please." She found him by the window, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "The board meeting is scheduled for 2 o'clock, he said without preamble. "You'll need to be my proxy. I thought you were going to video conference in." "Too risky. They could claim technical difficulties delay crucial votes." He handed her a document. "This gives you full voting authority in my name. James will accompany you." Sarah stared at the paper, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "Alexander, I know what I'm asking," he said softly. "And I know why Rebecca and Marcus are so desperate to stop this trip. It's not just about the company anymore." "What do you mean?" He wheeled closer, his voice dropping. 6 years ago, before the accident, I discovered something. Irregularities in the company's offshore accounts, connections to some very powerful people. I was gathering evidence, planning to present it to the board. And then the accident happened." Sarah finished, pieces falling into place. "The evidence disappeared the day Rebecca left. I always assumed she destroyed it." His eyes met hers. "But Victoria's been hinting lately that maybe she just hid it. If that's true, if Rebecca still has those documents..." "That's why they're making their move now," Sarah realized. "They're afraid you'll remember something during your recovery, something that could expose them." Alexander nodded grimly. "Which means you need to be extremely careful. They'll try to manipulate you, maybe even threaten you. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, I want you and Emily on the next flight to Switzerland." "I'm not running." "Away," Sarah said firmly. "We're in this together." Something flickered in his eyes, pride, fear, and something deeper. A knock interrupted them. Dr. Patterson entered, followed by the medical transport team. "It's time, Alex." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Equipment was loaded, final instructions given, medications double-checked. Emily insisted on giving Alexander a good luck card she'd made, complete with encouraging messages in somewhat questionable French. Finally, it was time. The medical transport waited in the circular driveway, Dr. Patterson already inside. James's security team had swept the route to the private airfield multiple times. "Ms. Martinez," Alexander said formally, aware of the staff watching. I'm entrusting you with everything." Sarah understood he meant far more than just the company. "I won't let you down." He reached for her hand, squeezing it briefly. The touch sent electricity through her arm, and for a moment, the rest of the world faded away. Then Emily darted forward, throwing her arms around Alexander's neck in a surprise. "Good luck, Mr. Armstrong. The dragons will protect your castle while you're gone." To everyone's amazement, Alexander hugged her back. "Thank you, Emily. Keep your mother out of trouble for me." As the transport pulled away, Sarah felt a strange mix of hope and fear. Behind her, Victoria cleared her throat. "Sarah, there's something else you should know about those documents Rebecca took." But before Victoria could continue, James appeared with urgent news. "We have a problem. Rebecca and Marcus just called an emergency board meeting. They're moving up the timeline." Sarah straightened her shoulders, channeling Alexander's strength. "Then so are we. Victoria, whatever you know about those documents, tell me everything. It's time to stop playing defense." As she followed James inside, Sarah sent up a silent prayer for Alexander's safe journey. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same courage he was showing in Switzerland. After all, they were fighting for more than just a company now. They were fighting for a future neither of them had dared to imagine before. The boardroom of Armstrong Industries towered 40 stories above the city, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view that usually impressed visitors. But Sarah barely noticed the vista as she sat in Alexander's usual chair, surrounded by serious faces in expensive suits. "This is highly irregular," board member Harrison declared, glaring at the proxy document. "Mr. Armstrong can't simply hand over his voting rights to his caregiver." "My role as Mr. Armstrong's caregiver is irrelevant," Sarah replied calmly, channeling Alexander's commanding presence. "The proxy documentation is legally binding and has been verified by corporate counsel." Victoria, seated beside her, nodded in confirmation. James stood discreetly by the door, his presence both reassuring and intimidating. The boardroom doors opened and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Rebecca Armstrong walked in, as elegantly beautiful as in her photographs, followed by Marcus Chen. They moved with the confidence of people accustomed to getting their way. "Well, this is charming," Rebecca said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Alexander's really outdone himself this time, using his pretty young caregiver to fight his battles." Sarah met her gaze steadily. "I think we both know this is about more than corporate battles, Mrs. Chen, or should I say, Mrs. Armstrong. I'm never quite sure which name you're using these days." Rebecca's smile faltered slightly. Marcus stepped forward, his hand possessively on Rebecca's shoulder. "Let's focus on business, shall we? We have a proposal that the board needs to consider." For the next hour, Sarah listened as Marcus outlined their plan, a merger that would effectively give them control of the company. The numbers looked good on paper, but Sarah had studied Alexander's files thoroughly. She saw the hidden traps, the carefully concealed pitfalls. "Before we vote," Sarah interrupted as Marcus concluded, "I'd like to address some concerning patterns in the offshore accounts." Rebecca's perfectly manicured hand tightened on her water glass. "The offshore accounts aren't relevant to this proposal, aren't they?" Sarah pulled out a folder. "These transactions, dating back 6 years, show a systematic pattern of fund diversion. Interestingly, they began exactly 2 months before Mr. Armstrong's accident." The boardroom grew very quiet. Victoria straightened beside her, while James shifted slightly closer to the door. "What exactly are you implying?" Marcus demanded. "I'm not implying anything, I'm stating facts." Sarah met Rebecca's eyes. "Facts that were documented in certain missing files. Files that disappeared the same day you left." Rebecca's composure cracked just for a moment. "You're overstepping, Ms. Martinez. These accusations aren't accusations at all, yet," Sarah smiled, channeling Alexander's cool authority. "I'm simply establishing context for the board. After all, they should have all the information before voting on such an important decision." Her phone buzzed, a message from Alexander. A photo appeared on her screen. Him in the Swiss facility, giving a thumbs up before his pre-surgery procedures. The sight gave her strength. Mr. Armstrong is currently undergoing groundbreaking medical treatment, Sarah announced to the board, treatment that could restore his ability to walk. Interesting timing for this takeover attempt. Isn't it? His medical conditions are irrelevant, Marcus snapped. Are they? Or are you worried about what he might remember during his recovery, about what really happened the day of his accident? Rebecca stood abruptly. This meeting is over. We'll reconvene when Alexander returns. Sit down, Rebecca, Sarah said, quietly. We haven't voted yet, and I have more documents to share. The next hour was a carefully orchestrated dance of revelations. Sarah didn't have the smoking gun, the missing files Rebecca had taken, but she had enough circumstantial evidence to raise serious doubts. One by one, she saw board members' expressions change from skepticism to concern. I move to table any votes on the merger proposal until Mr. Armstrong's return, board member Powell announced. Others quickly seconded the motion. As the meeting adjourned, Rebecca lingered behind. When the room had cleared except for James and Victoria, she approached Sarah. You have no idea what you're getting into, she said softly. Alexander isn't the victim you think he is. Ask him about Project Phoenix. Ask him what really happened to our partner in Singapore. Before Sarah could respond, Rebecca turned and left, her expensive perfume lingering in the air. Victoria touched Sarah's arm gently. Don't let her get to you, she's trying to plant doubts. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. She pulled out her phone, looking again at Alexander's photo. What secrets was he still keeping? Back at the mansion, Emily was waiting with her tutor, eager to share her French progress. Maman, j'ai appris de nouveaux mots aujourd'hui. Sarah hugged her daughter, grateful for the moment of normalcy. But as they walked to the guest house, she noticed a sleek black car parked across the street. James had warned her they would be watched. That evening, as Emily slept, Sarah received a video call from Alexander. He looked tired but determined. How did it go? He asked without preamble. We bought some time, but Alexander, Rebecca mentioned something called Project Phoenix. His face darkened. Sarah, listen to me. There are things about my past, about the company. It's complicated. Then help me understand. I'm fighting for you, but I need to know what I'm really fighting against. He was quiet for a long moment. You're right. You deserve to know everything, but not over the phone. Once I'm through the first phase of treatment, come to Switzerland. There are things I need to tell you in person. Sarah felt her heart race at the intensity in his voice. Alexander, please, Sarah, trust me a little longer, and be careful, Rebecca won't give up easily. After ending the call, Sarah stood in her garden, looking up at the mansion that had become the centerpiece of this complex game. Somewhere, in that building, evidence existed that could explain everything. Rebecca had hidden it 6 years ago, but where? And more importantly, what would Sarah find when she finally uncovered the truth? Was she fighting for justice, or was she just another pawn in a game she didn't fully understand? The next week passed in a blur of activity. Sarah divided her time between managing the company crisis and coordinating with Dr. Patterson about Alexander's treatment. The surgery had been successful, but the real challenge, rehabilitation, was just beginning. He's pushing himself too hard, Dr. Patterson reported during their daily video conference. Typical Alexander, wanting to run before he can crawl. Sarah watched the video feed from Alexander's therapy session, her heart aching at the determination on his face as he struggled with the parallel bars. Can't you make him slow down? You know, Alexander, he's fighting battles on multiple fronts, his recovery, his company, his past. The doctor paused. He asks about you, you know, every day. Before Sarah could respond, Victoria burst into the office. We have a situation. Rebecca's been seen entering the mansion's east wing. Sarah's blood ran cold. The east wing had been closed since Alexander's accident. He'd never wanted to visit that part of the house again. How did she get in? She still has her old keycard. Technically, we never invalidated it. Victoria looked ashamed. I'm sorry, I should have thought of that. Sarah was already moving. Call James. Tell him to monitor all exits, but don't engage yet. She's looking for something specific, and I want to know what it is." The east wing was dark and musty, furniture covered in white sheets like ghost sentinels. Sarah moved quietly, following the sound of movement. She found Rebecca in what had once been Alexander's private study, methodically searching through old files. "Looking for something specific?" Sarah asked from the doorway. Rebecca didn't even flinch. "I wondered how long it would take you to find me." She turned, holding an old leather portfolio. "You've done well playing the devoted caregiver. Alexander always did have a weakness for nurturing women. Is that why you pretended to care for him, to gain his trust before betraying him?" "You have no idea what you're talking about." Rebecca's perfect composure cracked slightly. "You think you know him? You think you know what happened 6 years ago? You're just another replacement, another woman he's using to fill the void." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I'm the woman who's helping him heal, from his injuries, from his past, and from what you did to him." Rebecca laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Heal? Alexander Armstrong doesn't want to heal. He wants to win, to dominate, to control. Ask him about Singapore. Ask him what really happened to Michael Chang." "More breadcrumbs without context. I'm tired of your games, Rebecca." "Games?" Rebecca's voice sharpened. "This was never a game. Project Phoenix wasn't just about money. It was about power, influence, things you couldn't begin to understand. Alexander wasn't just a victim. He was a player." Sarah stepped closer. "Then help me understand. If Alexander isn't who I think—" "He is. Prove it. Show me the evidence." For a moment, something like uncertainty crossed Rebecca's face. Then they heard footsteps. James and his security team approaching. "Choose carefully who you trust, Sarah," Rebecca said, moving toward the second exit. "Not everyone is what they seem." She slipped away just as James entered. "Should we stop her?" he asked. Sarah shook her head, studying the disturbed files. "No. Let her think she has the upper hand." She turned to Victoria. "Get me everything. You can find about Michael Chang and Singapore, and book me a flight to Switzerland. It's time for some answers." Later that night, as Sarah packed for her trip, Emily helped in her own way by teaching Jeffrey the giraffe French phrases. "Maman, can we video call Mr. Armstrong? I want to tell him about my new French songs." Sarah smiled, remembering how Alexander's face had softened the last time Emily sang to him in French. "Of course, sweetie. But first, we need to talk about something. How would you like to visit Switzerland, see some real castles?" Emily's eyes lit up. "With snow and mountains, can we visit Mr. Armstrong?" "Yes, to all of those. But it might be different. Mr. Armstrong is working very hard to get better, to try walking again. He might be tired or frustrated sometimes." "That's okay," Emily said with childhood wisdom. "When I was learning to ride my bike, I got frustrated, too. But you told me that's part of learning new things." Sarah hugged her daughter, marveling at her simple, pure insight. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart, Maman. I get it from you." As Emily chatted about Swiss chocolates and snow angels, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Alexander. "Heard about Rebecca's visit. Be careful. Some doors are better left closed." Sarah typed back, "Too late. I'm already through the door. Time for the whole truth." His response came quickly. "Then come to Switzerland. Time to face all our demons." Sarah looked around the guest house that had become home, wondering what revelations awaited in Switzerland. Rebecca's warnings echoed in her mind, but her heart held firm. Whatever Alexander's past held, whatever secrets Project Phoenix might reveal, she was committed to this path. Because somewhere between being his caregiver and his defender, between fighting his battles and sharing his burdens, she had fallen completely in love with Alexander Armstrong. Not the powerful CEO, not the bitter recluse, but the complex, wounded, struggling man who was finally learning to trust again. The question was, would the truth bring them closer together or shatter everything they'd built? The Fee, Swiss medical facility, looked more like a luxury resort than a hospital. Nestled in the Alps, its modern architecture blended seamlessly with the majestic landscape. Emily pressed her face against the car window, enchanted by the snow-capped peaks and pristine forests. "It's like a fairy tale, Mummy. Do you think they have real princesses here?" "Better," Sarah replied, trying to calm her own nerves. "They have brave knights learning to walk again." Dr. Patterson met them in the lobby, his warm smile helping to ease Sarah's anxiety. "He's been asking about your arrival every hour. I've never seen him so distracted during therapy." Sarah's heart fluttered. "How is his recovery progressing?" "Remarkably well, despite his stubbornness. He's pushing himself harder than recommended. But," the doctor's eyes twinkled, "perhaps your presence will encourage him to pace himself better." They followed him through sunlit corridors to the rehabilitation wing. Through a large window, Sarah saw Alexander working with a physical therapist, his face set in fierce concentration as he gripped the parallel bars. Emily gasped. "Mr. Armstrong is standing." Indeed, he was supporting himself between the bars, his arms trembling with effort. Sweat dampened his shirt, but his expression showed pure determination. Then he looked up and saw them. The change in his face was immediate, softening, brightening, coming alive in a way Sarah had never seen before. "Emily, Sarah." The little girl couldn't contain herself. She burst into the room, only remembering to stop short when Sarah called her name. But Alexander was already reaching for her with one hand, maintaining his balance with the other. "Careful, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm. "I'm not quite ready for hugs yet, but soon." Emily beamed. "You're doing great. Just like when I learned to ride my bike. Little steps first, then bigger ones." Alexander laughed, a real, genuine laugh that transformed his entire face. "Your daughter," he said to Sarah, "continues to be the wisest person in any room." The physical. Therapist suggested a break, helping Alexander back into his wheelchair. Only then did Sarah notice the slight tremor in his hands, the exhaustion he was trying to hide. "You're overdoing it," she said softly when they were alone in his private room. "Probably." He wheeled to the window, gazing at the mountains. "But every step brings me closer to standing on my own, in every way." Sarah recognized his tone. "You're ready to tell me about Project Phoenix?" He turned to face her, his expression grave. "First, tell me what Rebecca said." "Everything." As Sarah recounted her confrontation with Rebecca, including the mentions of Singapore and Michael Chang, she watched Alexander's face carefully. Pain, guilt, and something like resignation crossed his features. "She's right, you know," he said finally. "I'm not the innocent victim in all this. Project Phoenix, it wasn't just a business venture. It was a way to consolidate power, to control markets across Asia. Michael Chang was our partner in Singapore." "What happened to him?" Alexander's hands tightened on his wheelchair's armrests. "He discovered we were using the project to hide certain transactions. Money laundering, market manipulation, nothing technically illegal but ethically questionable. He threatened to expose everything." Sarah felt her heart sink. "And then?" "I didn't know what Marcus had planned. I swear to you, Sarah. But Chang had an accident remarkably similar to mine. He survived, but..." Alexander's voice cracked. "His family blamed me. Maybe they were right." "Is that why Rebecca left? Because of what happened to Chang?" "No. She left because I was gathering evidence against Marcus, planning to turn everything over to the authorities. She warned me to let it go, said some powers shouldn't be challenged." His laugh was bitter. 2 days later, my brakes failed." Sarah moved closer, placing her hand over his. "And the evidence you gathered?" "Rebecca took it when she left, but she didn't destroy it. She's too smart for that. She kept it as insurance." He turned his hand to grasp hers. "Sarah, what I did, the choices I made, I'm not proud of them, but I'm trying to make things right. By exposing everything. By standing up, literally and figuratively, and facing the consequences of my actions." His grip on her hand tightened. "But I need you to understand what that means. When the truth comes out, I won't be seen as a victim anymore. The company, my reputation. I don't care about your reputation, Sarah interrupted. I care about the man you are now, the one who's fighting to be better. Their eyes met, and the air seemed to charge with electricity. Alexander tugged gently on her hand, pulling her closer. Sarah, Maman, Mr. Armstrong! Emily burst back into the room, followed by Dr. Patterson. They have hot chocolate with tiny marshmallows, and the chef speaks French better than me. The moment broke, but something had shifted between them. A truth had been shared, a barrier broken. As they listened to Emily's excited chatter about the facility's amenities, Sarah felt Alexander's eyes on her, full of unspoken words and promises. Later, watching Emily charm the entire rehabilitation staff with her French songs, Alexander spoke softly. I don't deserve either of you in my life. Deserve has nothing to do with it, Sarah replied. Love isn't about deserving, it's about choosing, growing, healing together. The word love hung in the air between them, neither taking it back or trying to qualify it. Outside, snow began to fall, adding to the otherworldly feeling of the moment. They were suspended in time, on the precipice of something profound. But Sarah's phone buzzed, Victoria's urgent text bringing reality crashing back. Rebecca found something. Board meeting called for tomorrow. They're moving forward with the takeover. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was about to escalate, in ways none of them could predict. The Swiss evening wrapped the medical facility in a blanket of serene quiet. Emily had finally fallen asleep in their suite, exhausted from her day of charming every staff member she encountered. Sarah stood on her balcony, watching the moonlight play on the snow, when a soft knock drew her attention. Alexander waited, outside her door in his wheelchair but dressed casually, a sight she'd rarely seen. Take a walk with me? The facility has heated indoor gardens. The gardens were a marvel of design, tropical plants thriving in the middle of the alpine winter, paths wide enough for Alexander's wheelchair to navigate comfortably. They moved in comfortable silence until reaching a secluded corner filled with orchids. I've been thinking about what you said, Alexander began. About love being a choice. Sarah's heart quickened. And? I've spent 6 years choosing anger, choosing isolation. It felt safer. He maneuvered his chair to face her. But then you and Emily crashed into my life with your dragons and French, lessons and unfailing honesty. Alexander, let me finish, please. His voice was soft but intense. Tomorrow, when Rebecca presents whatever she's found to the board, everything might change. My reputation, my company, my future. It's all at risk. But tonight I need you to know something. Sarah knelt beside his wheelchair, bringing them to eye level. Tell me. I'm choosing love, he said simply. I'm choosing you and Emily. Choosing hope over bitterness. Choosing to believe in second chances. Whatever happens tomorrow, that won't change. Tears pricked Sarah's eyes. Even if you lose everything. I lost everything once before, or I thought I did. His hand found hers. But you showed me that what I lost wasn't everything. It was just things, money, status, the ability to walk. They don't define who I am. And who are you? Sarah whispered. I'm a man who's learning to trust again, who's discovering that true strength isn't about standing alone, but about letting others help you stand. His free hand touched her cheek. I'm a man who's falling in love with his caregiver, even though it's probably incredibly inappropriate. Sarah laughed softly. Probably, but I'm falling in love with my employer, so we're even. The kiss, when it came, felt inevitable. Gentle at first, then deepening with months of unspoken longing. When they finally parted, Sarah rested her forehead against his. We should probably talk about tomorrow, she said reluctantly. Probably. But he kissed her again instead, making up for 6 years of keeping his heart locked away. Eventually, responsibility won out. They discussed strategy, what Rebecca might have found, how to counter whatever she presented to the board. But the tension that had always underlaid their interactions had transformed into something else. Partnership, trust, shared purpose. There's a safe in the East Wing, Alexander revealed. Behind my father's portrait. Rebecca knows about it. But She never found the combination. What's in it? Insurance of my own. Proof that Marcus was behind Chang's accident, that he orchestrated mine. I could never use it without exposing my own involvement in Project Phoenix, but he squeezed her hand. Maybe it's time to face all our demons. Sarah's phone buzzed, James updating them on the situation back home, but before she could check it, they heard small footsteps approaching. Emily appeared in her pajamas, clutching Jeffrey. "Mommy, Mr. Armstrong, I had a bad dream." Without hesitation, Alexander opened his arms. Emily climbed into his lap, settling there as if she'd done it 100 times. "Want to tell us about it?" The dragons were sad because their castle was changing. They didn't know if they would still have a home. Sarah and Alexander exchanged glances, struck by the metaphorical wisdom in her nightmare. "Change can be scary," Alexander said gently, "but sometimes it leads to better things. Like how I'm learning to walk again, or how you're learning French." Emily considered this. "So the dragons might get a better castle?" "Or maybe," Sarah suggested, "they'll learn that home isn't about the castle at all. It's about the people. Or dragons you love." "Like us?" Emily asked sleepily. "We're a family now, right? You and Mommy and me?" Alexander's eyes met Sarah's over Emily's head, full of emotion. "Yes, sweetheart, like us." Later, after Emily was back in bed, they lingered in the garden. "She's right, you know," Alexander said, "about us being a family. Whatever happens tomorrow, that's what matters most." Sarah's phone buzzed again, Victoria this time, with news that made her blood run cold. Rebecca didn't just find something, she found everything. All the Project Phoenix files, the offshore accounts, everything. Alexander absorbed this with remarkable calm. "Then we stop hiding. We tell the truth, all of it, and we face the consequences together." "Together," Sarah agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. As they made their way back inside, Sarah thought about how far they'd come. The bitter millionaire and the desperate single mother had found something neither expected. Not just love, but redemption, healing, and the courage to face hard truths. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight, in the peaceful Swiss garden, they had chosen their path, together. The private jet touched down under a grey winter sky. 2 weeks in Switzerland had transformed more than just Alexander's physical capabilities. There was a new strength in his bearing, a determination that went beyond mere stubbornness. Though still in his wheelchair, he now moved with the confidence of a man who knew his own path. Sarah watched him prepare for the upcoming confrontation, straightening his tie with practiced precision. Despite Victoria's warnings about the chaos awaiting them, they had decided to return early. Better to face their enemies on their own terms. "The board meeting starts in 2 hours, Victoria reported, tablet in hand. "Rebecca and Marcus have already arrived at the office. They've brought their legal team." "Of course they have," Alexander said dryly. "And our surprise?" James retrieved everything from the safe. "It's ready." Emily, who had been quietly drawing in the corner of Alexander's office, looked up. "Are the bad people trying to take your castle again?" Alexander wheeled over to her. "They're trying, but remember what we learned in Switzerland? Sometimes the biggest battles aren't about castles or companies. They're about being brave and telling the truth," Emily recited, making Sarah's heart swell with pride. "Exactly." Alexander studied Emily's drawing. Another castle scene, but this time with people holding hands in front of it. "Is that us?" "Uh-huh. See? You're standing between Mommy and me, because you're going to walk again, and we'll all be together." Alexander's eyes met Sarah's, full of emotion. The moment was interrupted by James entering with urgent news. "Sir, we've got movement. Marcus is trying to meet privately with board members before the official meeting." "Let him," Alexander said calmly. "He's playing the same old game. But today, we're changing the rules." Sarah touched his shoulder. "Are you sure about this? Once we start down this path..." "I'm sure." He covered her hand with his. "No more hiding, remember?" The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. Victoria coordinated with legal teams, while James ensured security was in place. Sarah helped. Alexander reviewed the documents from the safe one last time. evidence that would expose everyone's sins, including his own. "Ms. Martinez," Victoria said softly while Alexander was on a call. "Whatever happens in there, thank you for bringing him back to us, not just from Switzerland, but from himself." Sarah watched Alexander through the glass walls of his office, remembering the bitter man she'd met months ago. He brought himself back. He just needed to remember who he was. At last it was time. The elevator ride to the boardroom felt like ascending to a battlefield. Emily had been settled in Alexander's private office with her tutor, safe from the coming storm but close enough if needed. Outside the boardroom, Alexander paused. "Sarah." She knelt beside his wheelchair. "Yes?" "When this is over, when all the truth is out, marry me." Sarah's heart stopped. "What? Marry me? Not because of what might happen in there, but because these past months have shown me what really matters. You, Emily, the life we could have together, that's worth more than any company or reputation." Tears pricked Sarah's eyes. "You have terrible timing, you know that?" "I know. But I also know that I love you, both of you. Whatever happens next, that won't change." Sarah kissed him, not caring who saw. "Yes, of course yes." The boardroom doors opened to reveal Rebecca and Marcus already seated, their faces showing momentary surprise at Alexander's early return. The other board members sat in tense silence, papers and tablets ready for what promised to be an explosive meeting. "Well," Rebecca said smoothly, "the prodigal CEO returns, and with his caregiver still by his side. How touching." "Fiancé?" "Actually," Alexander corrected, causing several board members to shift uncomfortably. "But we're not here to discuss my personal life." Marcus leaned forward. "No, we're here to discuss Project Phoenix and your role in it." "You're right." Alexander's calm agreement seemed to throw them off balance. "Let's discuss everything. The money laundering, the market manipulation, Michael Chang's accident, and of course the attempt on my life." Rebecca's perfect composure cracked slightly. "You don't want to do this, Alexander." "Actually, I do. Because unlike 6 years ago, I'm no longer afraid of the truth. All of it." He nodded to Victoria, who began distributing documents. "Even the parts that implicate me." The room fell silent as board members began reading. Sarah watched faces change from confusion to shock to anger. But Alexander wasn't done. "You see, Rebecca, you taught me something important when you betrayed me. You taught me to keep insurance. Everything in that safe you never found. It's not just about Marcus's crimes, it's about all of us. Every decision, every compromise, every sin." Marcus stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. You'll destroy everything, the company, yourself." "Maybe," Alexander agreed, "but sometimes things need to break before they can be rebuilt properly." As the truth unfolded in that sunlit boardroom, Sarah watched the man she loved, finally, free himself from the chains of his past. The real battle wasn't for control of the company, it was for redemption. The aftermath of Alexander's revelations reverberated through the boardroom like aftershocks from an earthquake. Rebecca sat, frozen, her perfect mask finally cracking as she realized the extent of the evidence against them. Marcus alternated between rage and desperate negotiation attempts. "Think about what you're doing," he pleaded. "We can make a deal. Keep this private. Protect everyone's interests." "Like you protected mine." Alexander's voice was steel-wrapped, in silk. "Or like you protected Michael Chang's." The board members were still processing the documents, their faces showing various stages of comprehension and horror. Chairman Harrison finally spoke up. "These accusations, they're extraordinary, and you admit your own involvement in the initial stages?" "I do." Alexander wheeled himself to the head of the table. "I'm not here to claim innocence. I helped create Project Phoenix, helped hide its true purpose. But when I discovered how far Marcus was willing to go, I chose to stop it. And that decision nearly cost you everything," Sarah added softly. Rebecca's laugh was bitter. "Oh, please, don't try to paint him as some noble whistleblower. He was just as hungry for power as the rest of us." "You're right," Alexander agreed, surprising her. "I was, but nearly losing my life, my ability to walk, it has a way of changing perspectives." He turned to the board. I'm not asking for forgiveness or trying to save my position. I'm asking you to do what I failed to do 6 years ago. Make this right. The next hour was intense. Legal teams were called, authorities notified. Marcus attempted to leave, but found his path blocked by James's security team. Through it all, Alexander remained calm, answering questions honestly, accepting responsibility for his part, while ensuring everyone's crimes were exposed. Sarah stood by his side, offering silent support. She noticed his hands trembling slightly on his wheelchair's armrests, not from fear but from physical exhaustion. The trip from Switzerland, the stress, the emotions, it was all taking a toll. During a brief recess, she knelt beside him in a quiet corner. You need to rest. Soon, he promised, touching her cheek. First, there's one more thing I need to do. When the board reconvened, Alexander addressed them one final time. Gentlemen, ladies, you have decisions to make about the future of this company, but before you do, I want to be clear about my own path forward. He gripped the arms of his wheelchair, and Sarah's heart stopped as she realized what he was about to do. Slowly, carefully, using the strength built through weeks of therapy, Alexander Armstrong stood. The room fell silent. Rebecca's face showed genuine shock. Even Marcus stopped, his desperate negotiations with his lawyer to stare. 6 years ago, I let fear and bitterness trap me, not just in this chair, but in a prison of my own making. Alexander's voice was strong, though Sarah could see the effort it took him to remain standing. I'm choosing to walk away from that prison, literally and figuratively. Chairman Harrison leaned forward. What exactly are you saying? I'm stepping down as CEO. The company needs a fresh start, clean leadership. Alexander's eyes swept the room. I'll cooperate fully with any investigations, provide whatever evidence is needed. But my focus now is on healing, my body, my family, my soul. The pronouncement caused an uproar. Board members argued, lawyers consulted frantically. Marcus saw an opportunity and tried to press his advantage, but Alexander simply stood there, supported by his own strength and Sarah's love, finally free of the burdens he'd carried for so long. Later that evening, back at the mansion, Emily found them in the garden. Alexander was back in his wheelchair, conserving his strength, but his face showed peace rather than defeat. Did you win? She asked, climbing into his lap, her favorite spot now. Not exactly, sweetheart. But sometimes winning isn't about keeping the castle. It's about choosing what really matters. Emily considered this. Like how you chose Mommy. And me? Exactly like that. He hugged her close, meeting Sarah's eyes over their daughter's head. Some treasures are worth more than any castle. Sarah watched them together, marveling at how far they'd come. The bitter millionaire and the desperate single mother had found not just love but redemption. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be investigations, legal proceedings, rehabilitation challenges, but they would face it all together. Victoria found them there, her tablet full of news alerts about the day's events. The media's going crazy. Everyone wants interviews, statements, and the board, they're split on how to proceed. Let them figure it out, Alexander said, reaching for Sarah's hand. I have more important matters to focus on, like planning a wedding. Emily perked up. A wedding? In a castle? Well, Sarah laughed, I think we've had enough of castles, but maybe something simple, surrounded by people we love. With dragons? Emily asked hopefully. Alexander laughed, a free, joyous sound that filled the garden. Definitely with dragons, and French songs, and new beginnings, and all the love we can hold. As the sun set over the mansion that had once felt like a prison and now felt like a home, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here. From desperate choices to powerful love, from bitter walls to open hearts, they had all transformed. Alexander, Sarah, Emily, even the space around them. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would write their own fairy tale, one brave step at a time. The weeks following Alexander's revelations brought sweeping changes. The media coverage was intense, but for once Alexander didn't hide. Instead, he faced the cameras with Sarah by his side, telling their story with honesty and dignity. The image of him standing briefly during press conferences, supported by both his own determination and Sarah's steady presence, became a symbol of redemption and transformation. Rebecca and Marcus faced the consequences of their actions. The evidence Alexander had preserved proved devastating, leading to their arrest and the beginning of a complex legal process. But true to his word, Alexander didn't shy away from his own responsibility. "I helped create the system that enabled their crimes," he testified during one of the initial hearings. "My journey to make it right started the day I met someone who showed me that true strength isn't about power or control." The board ultimately decided to bring in new leadership, accepting Alexander's resignation while retaining him as a consultant. During the transition, it was a graceful exit that allowed him to focus on what mattered most: his recovery and his new family. One sunny morning, Sarah found him in the mansion's newly renovated gym, working with his physical therapist. His progress was remarkable. He could now walk short distances with minimal support. "You're pushing yourself too hard again," she observed, watching him navigate the parallel bars. "Actually," his therapist interjected, "he's been much more reasonable lately. I think having a wedding to walk down the aisle for has given him better perspective." Alexander reached the end of the bars, turning to face Sarah with a smile that still made her heart skip. "Speaking of the wedding, Emily has some strong opinions about the decoration." "Let me guess, dragons everywhere?" "Not everywhere," Emily's voice piped up as she entered the gym, fresh from her French lessons. "Just strategic places, for protection and good luck." The wedding plans had become a family project, with Emily taking her role as chief creative consultant very seriously. Her blend of French sophistication and fairy tale whimsy somehow worked perfectly for their unique celebration. Later that evening, as they sat in what was now their garden, Sarah and Emily having officially moved into the main house, Alexander shared news that would change their lives again. "The board approved my proposal," he said, watching Emily chase fireflies in the twilight. "We're converting the East Wing into a rehabilitation center, top-quality medical care for people who can't afford private facilities." Sarah squeezed his hand. "The Alexander Armstrong Center for Recovery?" "Actually," he smiled, "I was thinking of a different name, the Phoenix Center, because everyone deserves a chance to rise from their ashes." The symbolism wasn't lost on Sarah. Project Phoenix, which had nearly destroyed him, would be transformed into something healing and hopeful. It felt right, like all the pieces of their story were finally falling into place. Victoria joined them, carrying her ever-present tablet but looking more relaxed than she had in years. "The contractors can start next month, and Dr. Patterson has agreed to consult on the medical program." "Perfect timing," Alexander said. "We'll be back from our honeymoon by then." Emily spun around at this. "Can we really go to Paris for the honeymoon? All of us?" "All of us," Sarah confirmed. "Someone needs to teach the French how to properly incorporate dragons into their architecture." The sound of Alexander's genuine laughter still felt like a miracle. The bitter man who had once pushed everyone away was gone, replaced by someone who embraced joy, love, and even whimsy. As if reading her thoughts, he pulled her closer. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For taking that desperate job all those months ago, for not giving up when I tried to push you away, for showing me that sometimes the greatest strength is in letting yourself be vulnerable." Sarah touched his face gently. "Thank you for being brave enough to change." Emily flopped down beside them. Geoffrey the giraffe clutched tight. "Are you being romantic again?" "Yes," Alexander admitted shamelessly. "Is that okay?" "I guess," Emily sighed dramatically in perfect French fashion, "as long as you don't forget about the dragons." Victoria cleared her throat discreetly. Speaking of romance, the wedding planner sent some new sketches, and yes, Emily, she included dragons in the design, very elegant ones. As they reviewed the wedding plans, Sarah marveled at how natural it all felt. The mansion that had once seemed so cold and imposing had transformed along with its owner. Now it was filled with warmth, laughter, and yes, even the occasional dragon drawing. But more than the physical changes, it was the emotional transformation that took her breath away. Alexander's determination to walk again was matched by his commitment to being a better man, a loving partner, and a father figure to Emily. Each step in his recovery was a step toward the future they were building together. The media might focus on the scandal and redemption narrative, but the real story was simpler and more profound. Two wounded people who found healing in each other, and a little girl whose belief in dragons and happy endings helped make it all possible. The wedding. Day dawned clear and bright. The mansion's gardens transformed into an enchanted space that perfectly balanced elegance with whimsy. Small, tasteful dragon motifs were woven throughout the decoration, Emily's influence evident in the most sophisticated ways. Sarah stood in what had once been Alexander's private study, now their shared space, as her mother helped her with the final touches of her wedding dress. The room had changed along with everything else. Family photos mixed with business awards, Emily's artwork proudly displayed alongside valuable paintings. "Are you ready, darling?" her mother asked, adjusting the veil. Before Sarah could answer, Emily burst in, resplendent in her flower girl dress. "Maman, Papa Alex can walk. He's practicing with Dr. Patterson right now." The moment Emily had first called Alexander Papa, Alex remained one of Sarah's most precious memories. It had happened naturally during their time in Switzerland, and the joy on Alexander's face had been unforgettable. Victoria appeared in the doorway, elegant in her maid-of-honor dress. "Everything's ready. The guests are seated, the string quartet is in place, and yes, they learned that French lullaby Emily requested." The ceremony space took Sarah's breath away. The garden had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale, but an elegant, grown-up fairy tale. White roses and lilies created a natural aisle, and delicate dragon sculptures, crafted from crystal and silver, caught the morning light. But all of that faded when she saw Alexander actually standing, at the end of the aisle. He had insisted on practicing in secret, working with Dr. Patterson for hours to build the strength for this moment. Though he had a discreet support rail available if needed, he stood tall and proud, his eyes fixed on her with such love it brought tears to her eyes. Emily preceded her down the aisle, scattering rose petals and beaming at everyone. When she reached Alexander, she handed him a small dragon charm for luck before taking her place. The ceremony was personal and profound. They had written their own vows, each speaking from the heart about their journey from caregiver and patient to partners in every sense. "You saw past my walls when I was determined to keep everyone out," Alexander said, his voice strong with emotion. "You and Emily brought life and love back into my world when I thought those doors were forever closed." Sarah's vows spoke of courage, transformation, and the kind of love that heals. "You showed me that sometimes the most desperate choices lead us exactly where we need to be. You opened your heart not just to me, but to my daughter, creating a family I never dreamed possible." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander kissed her without any support but his own strength, a moment that symbolized how far they'd come. The reception was a blend of sophistication and joy. Emily charmed the guests with her perfect French, while James and Victoria finally relaxed enough to share some of the more amusing moments from the past year. Dr. Patterson raised a toast that brought tears to many eyes. "I've been a doctor for 30 years, but I've never seen healing quite like this. Some might call it a miracle, but those of us who watched it happen know it was something else. The power of love, determination, and perhaps a little dragon magic." As the evening progressed, Alexander and Sarah shared their first dance. Though he couldn't maintain his strength for long, those moments of swaying together, fully standing, were precious beyond words. "Happy?" he whispered in her ear. "Beyond happy," she replied, "though Emily is already planning renovations to the guest house." Alexander laughed. "Let me guess, a dragon observatory?" "Close, a combination art studio and dragon research center." She's very serious about it. Well, who am I to argue with our resident dragon expert? His eyes softened. She's amazing, you know, just like her mother. The party continued into the evening, but the most meaningful moment came later when the three of them stood in their garden. Emily, fighting sleep but determined to stay awake, had one last surprise. "I made this for us," she said, presenting a drawing. It showed the three of them standing together, surrounded by protective dragons, with French words carefully written. Across the top, "Notre famille," our family. Alexander knelt down to hug her, his balance perfect in that moment. "It's beautiful, sweetheart, just like our real family." As they tucked Emily into bed later that night, she mumbled sleepily, "Are we going to live happily ever after now?" Sarah and Alexander exchanged glances, both thinking of the journey ahead, the continued recovery, the new rehabilitation center, the life they would build together. "You know what, Princess?" Alexander said softly. "I think we already are." Later, standing on their balcony under the stars, Sarah wrapped her arms around her husband. "She's right, you know, this is our happily ever after. Complete with dragons," Alexander agreed, pulling her close. "And French lessons. And love," he added, kissing her softly. "Most importantly, love." The mansion stood quiet around them, no longer a symbol of isolation, but a home filled with joy, healing, and possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, new steps forward. But tonight, in this moment, they were simply a family bound together by love, courage, and perhaps a touch of dragon magic. 6 months after the wedding, the Phoenix Center for Recovery opened its doors. The east wing of the mansion had been transformed into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation facility, complete with a children's wing that Emily had helped design. Dragons, tastefully incorporated into the decor, watched over patients beginning their own journeys of recovery. Alexander, now walking with just a cane for longer distances, took particular pride in meeting each new patient personally. His story had become an inspiration, but it was his genuine empathy that touched people most deeply. "Remember," he told a young patient struggling with her first steps, "healing isn't just about the body, it's about believing in possibilities." Sarah, who had completed her nursing degree during the center's construction, divided her time between caring for patients and managing the facility's daily operations. Her experience as both a caregiver and partner to someone in recovery gave her unique insight into what families needed. Emily had become the unofficial mascot of the center, brightening patients' days with her French songs and stories about protective dragons. Her own little art studio in the converted guest house became a favorite retreat for younger patients and their siblings. One afternoon, as Sarah finished her rounds, she found Alexander in their garden, watching Emily teach French to a young patient's sister. "Je m'appelle Sophie," the little girl repeated carefully, while Emily nodded encouragement. "Your daughter," Alexander said as Sarah joined him, "has quite the teaching method. Dragons and French, who knew it would be such a successful combination?" Sarah leaned against his shoulder. "Speaking of successful combinations, Dr. Patterson called. The latest test results are excellent. He says you might not need the cane." "That all soon?" Alexander smiled, pulling her closer. "Just in time for our trip to Paris. Emily's been practicing her tour guide speech for weeks." The trip to Paris had become a family tradition in the making, their way of celebrating both their marriage and the success of the Phoenix Center. Emily was particularly excited about showing Geoffrey the giraffe the real Eiffel Tower. Victoria appeared with her tablet, though these days she wore more casual clothes and actually took vacation time. The interviews for the new physical therapy team went well, and you'll never guess who called. "Rebecca?" Sarah asked, noticing Alexander's slight tension. "Yes, she's agreed to testify against Marcus. Her lawyer thinks it might reduce her sentence." Victoria paused. She also asked about making a donation to the center through her family's foundation. Alexander was quiet for a moment, watching Emily and Sophie play. "What do you think?" he asked Sarah. "I think," she said carefully, "that healing comes in many forms, and sometimes the people who hurt us the most need healing themselves. He nodded slowly. Accept the donation, but with conditions. It goes specifically to the family support programs, helping people rebuild what was broken. Victoria made a note, then smiled. Oh, and James finally asked me to dinner. Finally, Sarah laughed. Emily will be thrilled. She's been trying to play matchmaker for months. Speaking of Emily's projects, Alexander said, she showed me her latest drawing. Apparently, we need a dragon nursery. Sarah's hand flew to her stomach, still flat but holding their secret. How did she? Our daughter is very observant. And apparently dragons always know when family is growing. His eyes were soft with joy. Are you ready for another adventure? With you? Always. Sarah kissed him softly. Though we might need to consult Emily on dragon-appropriate baby names. The sound of children's laughter floated across the garden. As Emily taught Sophie the French words for different types of dragons, the mansion that had once been a symbol of isolation and bitterness now rang with joy, healing, and hope. Later that evening, during the center's weekly community dinner, another of Emily's ideas, Sarah watched her family with pride. Alexander moved among the patients and families with natural grace, his own journey giving hope to others. Emily flitted between tables, spreading cheer in 2 languages. The staff, once kept at a cold distance, had become extended family. Maman, Emily called, rushing over with Sophie in tow. Can we show Sophie the Dragon Observatory tonight? The stars are perfect. The Dragon Observatory was really just a cozy corner of the garden, with comfortable seating and an unobstructed view of the night sky. But through Emily's imagination, it became a magical place where dragons soared between stars and anything was possible. Of course, sweetheart. Why don't you ask Papa Alex to tell the story of the constellation dragons? Alexander's stories, combining astronomy with dragon lore, had become famous among the center's younger visitors. He caught Sarah's eye across the room and smiled, the warm, genuine smile that still made her heart skip. As they gathered later under the stars, Emily snuggled between them, while Sophie listened with wide-eyed wonder. Sarah thought about the strange and beautiful path that had led them here. A desperate job application, a bitter man, a child's belief in dragons, and love, so much love, had transformed not just their lives, but the lives of countless others. The Phoenix Center was more than just a rehabilitation facility. It was a testament to the power of second chances, of rising from ashes, of choosing love over bitterness. And somewhere Sarah knew real or imaginary dragons watched over them all, protecting the precious magic of new beginnings. The Parisian morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight glinting off the Seine as the Armstrong family made their way through the Tuileries garden. Emily skipped ahead, Geoffrey the giraffe sporting a new beret, while she pointed out various landmarks to Sophie, who had joined their family vacation along with her parents, now close friends and supporters of the Phoenix Center. Alexander walked without his cane, his stride confident though measured. The past year had seen remarkable progress, both physical and emotional. The bitter millionaire was gone, replaced by a man who laughed easily and loved deeply. Papa Alex, Emily called, "Can we have breakfast at the Dragon Cafe?" The Dragon Cafe was actually a charming patisserie they'd discovered on their first trip, where the owner had delighted Emily by telling her ancient French legends about dragons. It had become their special place, a symbol of how their unique family blend of French culture and dragon lore had flourished. As they settled at their favorite table, Sarah felt the now familiar flutter in her stomach. At 4 months pregnant, she was just beginning to show, though clever clothing still kept their secret from most people. Emily, however, had taken to singing French lullabies to her future sibling every night. "I have a surprise," Alexander announced as they finished their croissants. "The renovation plans for the center's expansion arrived this morning." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "We're supposed to be on vacation." "This isn't work. This is family." He pulled out his tablet, showing them the designs. "The new wing will focus on pediatric rehabilitation, And look at the theme Emily inspired. The architectural rendering showed subtle dragon motifs integrated into child-friendly spaces, creating an environment that balanced medical necessity with imagination and hope. "It's perfect," Sarah said softly, watching Emily explain the drawings to Sophie in rapid French. "Just like our family," Alexander replied, squeezing her hand. Their peaceful breakfast was interrupted by a familiar face, Dr. Patterson, who was attending a medical conference in Paris. "I hoped I'd find you here," he said warmly, joining their table. "The research paper on the center's integrated family approach has been accepted for publication. You're changing the field, both of you." Alexander smiled. "We just created what we wished had existed during my recovery, a place where healing includes everyone, patients, families, even stuffed giraffes in berets." "And dragons," Emily insisted. "Don't forget the dragons." "Never," Alexander assured her solemnly. "Dragons are essential to any proper recovery program." As they strolled through Paris later that day, Sarah reflected on how far they'd come. The Phoenix Center had grown beyond their wildest dreams, helping families find hope and healing together. Victoria and James were planning their own wedding. Even Rebecca, serving a reduced sentence, had found a way to contribute to something positive through her foundation's support of family programs. That evening, they hosted a small dinner in their hotel suite for Dr. Patterson and some colleagues, interested in establishing similar centers in their own countries. Emily, ever the proud ambassador, gave a presentation on the importance of imagination in healing, complete with drawings and French vocabulary lessons. "Your daughter," one of the doctors commented to Sarah, "has a remarkable gift for connecting with people." "She taught me that first," Alexander said, joining the conversation. "When everyone else saw a bitter man in a wheelchair, she saw someone who just needed a little dragon magic in his life." Later, after Emily and Sophie had fallen asleep amid their books and drawings, Sarah and Alexander stood on their suite's balcony, the lights of Paris twinkling around them. "I never thought," he said softly, holding her close, "that accepting a desperate job application would lead to all this. A family, a purpose, a chance to turn past pain into future hope." "And dragons," Sarah added with a smile. "Don't forget the dragons." "How could I? Our daughter would never forgive me." His hand rested gently on her growing bump. "Do you think this little one will inherit her sister's dragon affinity? With Emily as a big sister? It's guaranteed." The sound of childish laughter drifted from inside. Emily and Sophie had woken up and were presumably planning their next day's adventures. The sound symbolized everything their lives had become, joyful, unexpected, full of love and possibility. "You know," Alexander mused, "sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't taken that job, if you hadn't been brave enough to face the bitter man I was." "I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been brave enough to change," Sarah countered, "to trust again, to love again." He kissed her softly. "I'm glad we'll never have to know. This reality, our family, the center, all of it is better than any other possibility." Inside, Emily's voice called out in perfect French, "Maman, Papa, the dragons say it's time for ice cream." They laughed together, sharing one more moment under the Paris stars before returning to their daughter's world of dragons and dreams. A world that had somehow become the most real and precious thing in their lives. 1 year later, the garden of the Phoenix Center buzzed with celebration. Patients, families, staff, and supporters gathered to mark both the center's anniversary and a personal milestone. Alexander's first steps without any support, walking confidently across the stage to address the crowd. "A wise little girl once told me that dragons make everything better," he began, smiling at Emily, who sat in the front row beside her baby brother Thomas. "At the time, I thought she was just being a child. Now I know she was teaching me one of life's most important lessons, that magic exists in believing, in hoping, in loving." Sarah watched from beside the stage, her heart full. Thomas, just 6 months old, was already showing signs of inheriting his sister's imagination. His nursery, decorated with gentle dragons that Emily had helped design, had become a favorite stop on patient family tours. "The Phoenix Center began as an attempt to make amends," Alexander continued, "to transform something born of darkness into a force for light. But it became so much more, a testament to the power of family, of second chances, of rising from our ashes to become something stronger and more beautiful than before. Emily beamed with pride as she cuddled Thomas, whispering to him in French about the protective dragons that watched over their family. At 8 years old, she had become a bridge between the young patients and the medical staff, her natural empathy and bilingual abilities helping frightened children find courage in their recovery. Victoria and James, now married and expecting their own child, sat nearby. The security expert and the executive assistant had found their own happiness in the wake of all the changes, their love story another testament to the transformative power of opening one's heart. But the real magic of this place, Alexander said, his voice strong with emotion, isn't in the medical equipment or the therapy programs. It's in the love that fills these halls. Love that begins in desperate choices and grows into something magnificent. Love that heals not just bodies, but souls. As if on cue, Thomas let out a happy gurgle. Emily immediately began singing their special French lullaby, the one she had created just for him, about baby dragons learning to fly. Other children joined in, the melody carrying across the garden. 1 year ago, Alexander continued, we opened these doors with a hope and a promise. Today we've helped hundreds of families find their way back to joy. We've seen miracles, not just medical ones, but the miracles that happen when people choose love over fear, hope over bitterness, courage over comfort. Sarah stepped forward to join him on stage, their success as partners extending far beyond their personal life. The integrated family approach they had developed had become a model for rehabilitation centers worldwide. None of this would have been possible, Alexander said, taking Sarah's hand, without a brave woman who saw past my walls, a remarkable child who believed in dragons, and the incredible team that has become our extended family. As the celebration continued, Emily led the younger children in a dragon parade through the garden, their laughter mixing with the music and conversation. Thomas watched from Sarah's arms, his eyes following his sister's every move. She's going to be quite the big sister, Alexander observed, wrapping his arms around them. She already is, Sarah replied, watching Emily help a young patient join. The parade, despite his crutches, she learned from the best how to turn pain into purpose. The evening wound down with a special surprise. Emily's debut as a storyteller, sharing the tale of how dragons helped heal a bitter king's heart. The parallels weren't lost on anyone who knew their family's story, but Emily had transformed it into something magical and universal. And the dragons weren't just outside the castle, she concluded, her French and English blending melodically. They were in their hearts all along, helping them learn to love and trust and believe in magic again. Later that night, after the celebrations had ended and Thomas was asleep in his Dragon Watch nursery, the family gathered in their special observatory corner of the garden. Emily, fighting sleep but determined to stay awake, had one last thing to share. I made this, she said, presenting a drawing. It showed their family, Alexander standing, tall Sarah by his side, Emily holding Thomas's hand, surrounded by dragons of all colors. But these dragons weren't just protective. They were celebrating, breathing streams of starlight instead of fire. It's us, she explained unnecessarily, but also everyone we help, because now we're all dragon families, aren't we? All helping each other be brave and strong and loving. Alexander knelt to hug her, his movement smooth and natural now. Yes, sweetheart, that's exactly what we are. They looked up at the stars together. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here, from a desperate single mother and a bitter millionaire to a family that had helped change hundreds of lives. From a cold mansion to a warm home filled with love, laughter, and yes, plenty of dragons. Je t'aime, Emily whispered, half asleep between them. We love you too, they answered together, adding in French for good measure. Notre famille de dragons. Above them, stars twinkled like dragon eyes watching over their precious charges. And in that moment, it was easy to believe that magic was real, that love could heal all wounds, and that sometimes the most desperate choices led to the most beautiful destinations. For in the end, their story wasn't just about recovery or redemption. It was about the magic that happens when hearts open, when love wins, and when you believe, really believe, that dragons make everything better.